and welcome to episode 158 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Are you sweating as much as I am up there, bud?
It's not so bad. I think you're hotter down in Los Angeles than I am up here.
I mean, I think most people would agree. Thank you, though.
Yeah, I knew where you're going with that.
It's 97 outside today, and I have not let it deter me from a drink that I wanted to drink. So maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, please tell me about that and your life in the 1840s.
That's great. Well, for the one thing, I was actually up in Napa a week and a half ago, Labor Day weekend. I missed you, regrettably. You were out of town. But I've had kind of a sore throat ever since. That combined with the fact that I'm determined to speed the onset of fall here. It's one of my favorite seasons. One of my 4 favorites. I decided I would make a hot toddy. So I've got a steaming cup of tea and bourbon with some lemon and honey in it, hoping it does the throat some good. But if it doesn't help the throat, it'll at least help me.
You seem to like that drink, and I've never had it, and I don't think I ever will. So
it's an old-timey drink. They used to sell it out of the back of wagons, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly what my reference to the 1840s was all about.
I knew what you meant.
Now, you were up here, and oddly enough, I wasn't. I was down in Las Vegas, just kind of hanging out, having fun, met up with some friends, did a little gambling. And
how'd that go? You want to elaborate or just skate past it?
It didn't go that well.
Okay. Moving on.
Sometimes it goes great, sometimes it doesn't.
You usually
doesn't
win.
really matter.
Yeah.
I honestly think no matter what, you win. I meet up with some friends that I've had for a long time. We had a really good time. So even if you lose a little bit, and I think I lost a little bit more than usual this time, I still have a great time. And one of my friends, his wife is in one of the shows. And so she wasn't in it that night, but she took us to watch her show at one of the hotels. And that was actually really cool. So you get to see all the people and meet a bunch of the people who are like floor managers and some of the others. So I thought that was actually like a really unique Vegas experience.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. I'm still determined to go see something at the Sphere. I just jumped to the top of my concert list, venue list anyway.
I've been to the Sphere twice, but I haven't seen a concert there. And I would say this much, go. It is completely worth it. The movie they show is amazing. I'm just waiting for... I would really like Muse to play there. I think they're big enough to like sell it out for like 10 nights. Then I'll go.
Yeah, I could see a mini residency for somebody like that. I know you don't like Fish, but all the videos I saw from their little brief stay, mind-blowing, unbelievable.
I'm sure it was really cool. I'm just not a jam band guy, so Fish, The Dead, that kind of stuff doesn't really like move me.
I heard somebody describe it the other day as 4 stepdads who can't finish a song. And I was like, that's pretty perfect.
25 minutes later.
Yeah.
That's probably about right.
All right. On that silly note, what are you drinking?
Well, you know, the U.S. Open, the tennis tournament just ended, and I discovered midway through it that they have this drink that sounded really good to me. It's called a honey deuce, and they post the recipe online, and it's like Grey Goose vodka with Chambord, which is like a raspberry liqueur, and then you put it in lemonade, and I was like, this sounds like it's right up my alley. So I've got a version of that. I think that's actually pretty good. And from a music standpoint, when I was in Vegas at Caesars, the Killers are playing there. And even though I didn't go see them, I kept seeing the people every night, which was really cool. So the song that we've chosen is actually Somebody Told Me, which has a lot to do with our discussion of the test, because some of what we require to kind of like discuss the September 2024 LSAT and recap it is that people tell us a little bit about it. So I think that song, which is a cool song anyway, is perfectly apropos for what we're doing here.
I'm surprised it took us this long to stumble on that insight, because it's a perfect song.
Yeah. Maybe the next time. I'm actually going to be in Vegas in about 5-6 weeks. Maybe I'll go see them then again, but I'm also going to like a big festival there. So maybe not, but people coming out look pretty happy, and they flooded Caesars every single time that show ended. So it was pretty interesting.
Well, there you go. All right. Let's dig a little deeper into the heart of the matter here. Let's talk about the LSAT world. Couple tests coming up. We got some webinars coming up, and then I'm sure you have some stats for the September test itself.
I do.
Well, let's do it. I'll start with the upcoming tests, and then you can run us through some webinars. How's that?
Fabulous.
I debated going into some tests into 2025, January, February, but instead I'm just going to focus on the next 2, the final 2 tests to close out this year. The next one obviously is next month, October 2024. The registration deadline for that test has regrettably passed, as has the refund deadline, which was a week later. Registration was back in August 22nd specifically. The test dates on this one are a little weird, as we've talked about a few times. It starts on a Tuesday, October 1st, and then goes Tuesday the 1st, Wednesday the 2nd, skips for some reason, Thursday the 3rd, and then finishes up with 2 final days on Friday and Saturday the 4th and the 5th. I don't know if you've ever gotten any response as to why they skipped that Thursday.
No, and I forgot to ask.
That would explain the no response.
I've been really busy, as we'll talk about a little bit more, but I will ask. By the time that test goes off, I'll have the answer. I just have not thought about it recently because I've been so focused in September, and as you know, I have visitors here too, so
I do know that.
These are just busy.
Which I think we'll talk about in just a second. The score release for October is on a Wednesday, October 23rd, and then we will right into the next month, so the 4th of 4 straight months, November test. The good news here is if you do need to take another test this year, depending maybe on how September just went for you, November is still open for registration. You've got until the 26th of this month, so September 26th, to register for November. That test is going to go back to normal with 4 consecutive days, Wednesday the 6th of November through Saturday the 9th. And then finally, you will get your score the day before Thanksgiving on Wednesday, November 27th, bright and early, to hopefully give some good news, something to be thankful for that week.
Yeah, I don't know if I love them doing it the day before like a major U.S. holiday. Obviously, Canadians listening to this are like, what? Our Thanksgiving's at a different point. But in the U.S., that's the day before. I'm not loving that.
And it's a huge travel day as well, I think is what bothers me, is you're going to have people, in the air, for instance, when scores come out, or people trying to navigate airports. So I can see that being a little bit extra added to all the chaos that already exists as people try to get home or run from home during Thanksgiving.
That's exactly the case. Now, if you are taking one of those LSATs, as usual, we run a bunch of webinars that are free for everyone. And here's a couple. There's one actually, I think, on the day this comes out, which will be a Tuesday, the 10th. There's an RC comparative reading webinar, really to us tomorrow night, but to everyone listening to this, it would be that same evening. Then a week later, on the 17th, we've got a parallel reasoning LR webinar. And then on October 2nd, we've got LSAT 101, which is for this new LSAT format. So no logic games there. And then, John, kind of out of order chronologically, but something that I think is worth you and I discussing, kind of in the middle of all that, on the 18th of September, we are going to do the crystal ball for the October and November LSATs. And as we mentioned before, if we felt that we got August and September in pretty good shape, we would make this public once again. We would make it free once again, and we would make the recording available to anybody who wasn't able to attend. And that is, in fact, the case. So that's coming up on the 18th. And everybody out there listening, if you're taking October or November, we encourage you to join us. And we'll kick the format up around a little bit. We'll change it. We'll also remove the LSAT question that we kind of showed back in August and September so that we don't have any LSAC violations, because they definitely check on us about those types of things. And unfortunately, we were all to the good for that. And I want to keep in the rules with them.
Yeah, to preempt a question that I know is going to be asked probably of both of us, certainly of me, which is, are you guys going to do another mini bowl specific to November? And the answer is always the same. We'll see. We'll see what happens in October. If we get so much right in October that it forces us to reconfigure or adjust, then yeah, sure, we'll do a mini ball. We just did one for the September test here, and thank goodness we did, because everything we changed and updated about it happened to come exactly true. As we'll obviously discuss going forward. For now, though, that crystal ball coming up should apply to both tests. So whether you're taking October or November, try to be there for it. We'll have you covered either way.
Yeah, and we got some questions. People were asking, like, why did you take it private? And again, we said, we didn't know what they were going to do in August and September. And also we wanted to show some questions, which we did. And if we felt like what they were doing continued in the pathway of what they were doing, we would go back to a public format. We weren't trying to, take it away from people. We're actually doing something that we felt was the right thing to do. I think that's been justified, at least in our minds, which is really what matters. And so now we will return it to the public. And that was our plan all along. We just said, we just don't know if we'll be able to do that. We have to see what happens. But happily for us, and hopefully for everyone out there, we're going to bring it back. It will be free. There is a sign-up form. If you go to powerscore.com/free seminars, it will redirect you right to a page that has that webinar front and center, and you can just click on it and sign up. and then you'll have access to it on the 18th, and then you'll get access to the recording thereafter.
There we go. All right.
Let's get into it. Let's get into the September.
Do you want to talk about your house guest first, or should we get into September at this point? There's no clean way to insert this little tidbit.
You know, it's really funny because this has just been like constant LSAT. You were up here, I was down in Vegas. We got back and it just became the LSAT world. But I actually have a pretty well-known LSAT celebrity hanging out with me for part of this week. She's been here for a couple of days, and it's a good friend of mine and certainly yours as well. And that's Ellen Cassidy, who wrote The Loophole in Logical Reasoning. I guess in LSAT Logical Reasoning, I should be specific about it, which is a really cool book that I happen to be a big fan of. And as you know, John, I helped edit that book originally. I guess I'm credited as the editor.
I think, you're probably in there somewhere with some acknowledgments, as you should be. I watched you go through early drafts of it.
Well, that's all her. She did all the work. But one of the cool things to me is that Loophole, as well as the Bibles, they work in tandem. They don't contradict each other. But she and I have known each other for years. As some people know, she used to be a Power Score teacher.
Yeah.
And after she left, she started working on this. And I feel like it's a really important thing to have different voices out there in the LSAT world. So I was happy to help out when asked to do so. But she comes out here. She used to live in the Bay Area, so we used to see each other quite a bit. Now she lives in Texas, which I think she really likes. In talking to her, she's like, I like Texas the best.
Seems to be the trend these days. She may get a neighbor out of me here before too long.
I have told her that you were talking about it, moving down to Austin, which is where she's at. I guess there's a big tech boom going on in Austin. Maybe there's a big LSAT boom going on in Austin as well. But she's been around, and we've been kind of hanging out talking about LSAT and stuff like that. So you've actually probably spent a little bit more time on the September LSAT than I have, in part due to that. But it's always fun to hang out with like-minded LSAT people, especially somebody who's very passionate about it. So
yeah, she's just an interesting, good time person anyway. She's a lot of fun.
She's fun. And my wife and daughter get along with her extremely well, as does my dog even. So it's just a pretty relaxed, fun time. And she's still here now. I said, I'm going to go record this, but I'm going to mention that you're here. And I think she was like, that's cool. But she'll be moving on in the next day or so. And floating on down the road. But
I hope she's having a honey deuce in your absence, Dave.
I don't know. We did some wine tasting yesterday. That was fun. And I was like, I hadn't drank wine in a while, and I got a headache after about an hour or two, but it was still a good time. We actually went to a winery that you've been to with me before, John, and that's Hall.
Hall, I figured that's probably that's the go-to with, guests in town.
It's such a gorgeous facility, and the view's incredible. But let's talk a little bit about the September 24 LSAT here. And let's go through the numbers on this, because you had about 18,000 people take this test, which is really interesting because the registration numbers were like over 25,000 at one point. And then it really comes down. That is not abnormal. There is often a 20% or more attrition rate, a melt as we all call it. So when you go through this, on Wednesday the 4th, you had about 4,100 people. So the first day, around 4,100. The second day, around 3,400. Then it jumped back up to Friday on 4,700. And then finally Saturday ended it. It was really the biggest test of the day or of the week. It was about 5,800 people that ended it, which isn't surprising because there's no work conflict and so forth. So the main test administration runs that Wednesday through Saturday. It is now over. Anybody who's been on a forum or anything like that has seen that people are now allowed to talk about the topics and so forth. There is still one more test day coming. That is on Tuesday, the 17th of September. That'll be the day before that we do the crystal ball. That'll be makeups for anyone who had a problem. As always, there are some people who run into issues. I think when we take a look at scores coming out, though, even if you take the later test, your scores will still come out at the same time as everyone else. That'll be the 25th of September. And at least as far as problems, John, I didn't see any kind of like major systemic issues and no kind of database outage. Prometric didn't go down, anything like that. But there are always some minor problems. And of course, when I say minor, I mean in terms of the numbers of people affected. But anytime you're a person that's affected, it's major and it's going to bother you. There's always issues with some proctors, some technical connection issues. We know there were some center issues. For example, there was a center in Phoenix, I think it was the Camelback location, that had some kind of Wi-Fi or connectivity issue. And so that was something where, people were told, they showed up, hey, you're not going to test today. And that problem stretched over 2 days. And so they either had to take it later or they had to be pushed into the retake or something like that. So we're not trying to downplay any problems that people had. We know they're there, but it's better than, say, 5,000 people being affected by a major outage, because that kind of thing has happened in the past. Thankfully, it hasn't happened in quite a while now.
Yeah, that is good news. And I think in a way we may have dodged a bullet of sorts, or students did at least, because LSAC had a huge system outage for quite a while, either yesterday and or today. So there were some issues. Was it this morning?
Yeah.
My days blur together, test weeks. You know this. But yeah, had that happened, say, on a Saturday, that would have been the sort of systemic issue that could have caused a lot of trouble for people. Fortunately, it just happened on a Monday post-test.
Yeah, fortunately. Because when they go down, everybody goes down.
That's exactly right.
And that would be a huge problem. So let's go ahead, John, and get into the discussion about recapping this test, and then we will end the episode. It's going to take a little bit to get through this with a discussion of the scoring matrix. So as usual, I'll roll through some disclaimers and kind of reminders and really just qualifications about what it is that we're doing. And the very first one is always the same as the last one, which is we just ask that you don't summarize what we say online. As usual, this test has nuance. It's really easy for a summary to act like everything's black and white when in fact we've said things that are not just, crystal clear like that. We'd prefer that people hear what we have to say directly. It's a free podcast, so just say, hey, go listen to it. We'd prefer that. My first kind of point after that is one that it's frustrating to me every single time, but it seems like it's almost an entrenched part of this process, John, and that is the reminder that section order does not mean you had the same test. If you had RC, LR, LR, RC, and you walk out and you're like, man, that second RC was the hardest, and then someone else has the same order, a lot of times what you see is people say, I had the same test. You don't know that. Your content could be entirely different. Also, you could have the same content, but in a completely different order. That first person's second RC could be your first one. So then someone will come back and say, no, my first RC was really hard. And then all of a sudden be like, oh, we had different tests. No, you might not have. The LSAT, I'm not going to say it's your enemy, but it's certainly a mountain you have to climb. If you're going to go ahead and climb a mountain, you want to learn about the route and the path that you have to take. Understanding how content is changed throughout the day, how order is really irrelevant to the people who make this test is really an important part of this, so that if you hear somebody say, my second RC was hard, and you're like, my second RC was easy, you don't automatically think that you had completely different tests. You just might have had different orders. So I probably will say that every time till the end of all this.
Well, thank you for saying that. That was the thing that drove me the craziest, both in getting it from people and watching people confuse themselves publicly about it. Your second section, including even question counts. I had a 25 question LR section first. Anybody else have that section? That is a meaningless question.
There's multiple 25 LRs out there. I think it's tough because there's just this kind of past historic bias in thinking that everybody gets the same test in the same order. That's what happens in high school. It's what happens in college. A lot of old standardized tests have that. The LSAT does not operate that way. It changes content throughout the day and throughout the week. It also changes section order throughout the day and throughout the week. Now, that makes it look like there's a billion versions of this test. As you and I know, John, in this particular exam, there's only really 18 total combinations that it looks like they administered on a widespread kind of scale. And we don't even think they used all 18, because sometimes there's combinations that tend to appear more frequently, but they could have done up to 18. When you start adding scale order and thinking that that is something, then all of a sudden it proliferates into the hundreds. So
yeah, I think part of the confusion on this too is when people talk about practice tests, disclosed PTs, and I did PT 152, they do have the same content for everyone.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to think about, oh, that administration from September 2018, here's that tough question. That's not how it works on live testing weeks.
Yeah, it's actually a feature I wouldn't mind building into kind of like the testing system, randomized section.
Randomizing it, yeah.
Yeah, so you might take PT 150 and get one set of orders, and the next person who takes it after you gets a different set of, order there. Either way, it's just something to be aware of that I think you and I both watch happen, and we really want to jump in and start correcting people, and then we're like, we really shouldn't do that. We don't want to start giving away too much information during the test itself, because that usually invites a discussion of content. And that is something, that's the next point I'll kind of talk about, is the disclosure of info. I think everybody knows that LSAT does not want people talking during the test about content in a public manner. So if you go out on, say, Reddit or a forum and you start saying, I had all this content, a lot of times you'll see it wiped away. What they don't mind is that after the test, the main administration is over, that you then recap it, which is why we do what we do, which is why you see some forums trying to do that a little bit these days. And they're okay with that because they feel like the test is over. It's not going to change anything. So you can talk about generalities and topics. You can kind of like go into, what that LR stimulus was about or what that RC passage was about. What they don't want you to talk about is specific answers or solutions. And so we won't do that either. We'll just talk about the overall ideas that were here. I will say that when people write us and they send us a lot of information on the weekend after the test is over, especially, if we don't hear from you, we won't know whether or not your test actually occurred. And so that's especially the case with like international test takers who have a much smaller group that they're going through. So if you're like, I don't see anyone talking about this after the test is over on Saturday night, send it to us. We can always just add it to the information that we have. I'll also remind everybody that when you take a real LSAT, you usually feel way worse than when you take a practice test because the pressure is real. There is no tomorrow in the sense of like, you can't just say, all right, I'm going to walk away from this and start again in an hour. It is a scored test. You might be able to cancel it, but everything goes on your permanent record at that point. When we talk about what's easier or harder, remember that it just goes back to the fact that all LSAT sections are difficult, but there is a range of difficulty inside that. If we think that every single section is hard overall, that doesn't mean that they're all equal though. Some of them are on the easier side of that hardness. Some of them are on the more difficult side of that hardness. And so just be aware that it is all relative. Also be aware that the test makers are very savvy. They are putting similar topics in different sections. So for example, just because you had astronomy in RC does not mean that you had the same astronomy passage as someone else, as we will see very shortly here. So when you talk about it, if you're saying, oh, I had this and it's really too broad, you actually won't be able to know for sure that you are talking to someone else who had the exact same section, which we see all the time causing confusion online. They do this in LR, they do this in RC. It is something that is pretty common. Also, keep in mind that when we talk about this section is real, to our knowledge, we've never been wrong about it. And that's now covering hundreds of sections in terms of these discussions. But one of the things that we assume, and we haven't seen anything that disproves this, is that if a section was used as scored previously, that when it comes back, it will be used as scored again. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of like when we're making estimations of this. Like I said, I don't think we've been wrong yet. There's certainly been nothing to prove that or show it in all the tests that have been released. And you can, in fact, determine what is real and what is experimental beyond a shadow of a doubt. We've been able to do that every single time so far. If there comes a point in time where we can't, we'll say that. We'll be like, we're not sure about this section.
Can I put a small asterisk on that when you're done?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is there are occasional outlier moments where they will take an old 4-section non-disclosed test, February 2016 or something, that had 2 LRs and an RC and back in the day games. And they will use that again for, say, like a makeup exam or some sort of specific accommodation situation. And in that case, they may turn one of the prior scored LRs or something into an experimental just to make it fit the new format. But that is an extremely rare event. And when that happens, we always make note of it. What we're talking about is major administrations like the one that we're going to cover here.
Yeah, and that has not happened on this test.
No, not at all.
In fact, that's so rare, John, I don't even know if we should even talk about it in the future. But either way.
Lesson noted.
Almost the last point. It is possible that you don't hear one of your sections discussed. First off, a lot of people forget what their topics were. So the chances are pretty good that we did talk about it. You just didn't recognize the questions that we mentioned. you don't recall it. And that's, the LSAT's very stressful. People tend to have almost a waterfall of memory, and sometimes it's not very clear at all. That happens. It's also possible, but less likely, that what occurred was that you had a test form that was administered to not many people. We know that happens on occasion, especially with people who've taken the LSAT a lot. They may have seen a lot of the content, and they get a section that maybe only like 30 people saw. If we don't hear from you, there is no way for us to reference it across our database and figure out what's going on. So that's just something that is luck of the draw. If you go through this and you're like, I didn't hear my section, and we'd get this every single time almost, send us a message. Most of the time we're like, actually, the section you're talking about is this one. And it's like, oh, I didn't realize that from that description, but you're right. Very rarely do we discover that we haven't covered something in there, but we're always vigilant as to whether that might have occurred or not. That brings us to the last point, which is that, once again, I ask that you do not summarize this online. So pretty simple. It's a free podcast. Just send people right here.
Thank you for all that, Dave. I know it's a lot to cover, but you're a hero for getting through it every time. I don't know why we always put that part on you, but it does give me a chance to drink. So
I don't know if I'm a hero, but I do
know that I'm great.
Put it that way.
That's pretty Herculean. Let's get into the test itself. And fortunately here, there were no internationals. Fortunately for us, because it cleans it up. If you're international and wanted to take it, not so fortunate. Let's talk about the domestic September 2024 LSAT. This should also include anyone who took it with specific accommodations, whatever those happen to be. We'll try to include all of that as we go through it. And the first place that we always start these recaps with is self-assessment. We did a crystal ball originally for the past two tests, for August and September. And then, as I referenced earlier, we did a mini ball, kind of an update, specific for September itself. I'm going to focus on that mini ball, the recent session that we just posted in the student centers for our people. And let's talk about how that went. And the first thing I'll say is the reason we're able to, and echoing Dave from before, the reason we're able to take this back public is because of how well our predictions have gone for August and now for September. So to preface this a little bit, and spoiler to a degree, this was a home run in much the same way that August was. In fact, I might say that this was even better. Of the two main tests that we predicted to be used for this exam, and that was October of 2022 reuse and November of 2022 reuse, November 2022 was reused in full, first as the week's most tested content. So the majority of what people any day this week got came from the November 2022 LSAT. And as we will see, that included 2 whole sets of anticipated logical reasoning, 2 entire sets of reading comprehension, one of which we gave all 4 topics of. Every passage in one of, in fact, the main reading comp section that was used here, we predicted. Here's where it gets even better. In fact, not only did we predict that exact test for reuse, November 2022, but every single section over all 4 days that we saw was either brand new, so impossible to predict, obviously, or it came from just that exam, which is to say any reuse that people saw this week came from the test that we told them was most likely, as a pair at least, to appear. We went so far as to say, look, go check out the podcast recap of this, episode 122. This is very, very likely to be what you'll see. But it got even better for us because not only was it very likely, it was all that people saw. It was either new or it was this, our prediction, period.
You know, John, I think maybe the next podcast we do might be a further discussion of what it is we're trying to do with the crystal ball.
I've already started writing it.
Okay. It's funny that, because I think you and I have had this thought independently then, because I was looking at some of the comments that I saw on Reddit about the crystal ball, and I was like, I still don't think people quite understand what the goal of it is. They're like, oh, just knowing about the topics doesn't matter. And I'm like, I can understand that. But of course, if you do know the topics, you knew immediately what was real and what wasn't. And that does matter quite a bit. So I'm like, even on that point, it's incredibly useful. Then I also saw a lot of people saying like, well, anybody can predict that there's going to be a passage about, oh, I don't know, kind of like space or, a female writer. And I'm like, yes, but did they predict it was the female writer Zora Neale Hurston or Lillian Hellman, or is in this case the painter Vermeer, or something as specific as cryptomnesia? No. And that's the difference. It's not broad. I think it's also, as you point out very carefully, but I think this point is easy to lose. You're like, look, some of this content we're not trying to predict. we can't predict something that has either been used so long ago or tested so lightly in terms of experimentals that it looks new to us. We're not trying to predict that. We're also not trying to predict experimentals. I don't care what's experimental, quite honestly, except for knowing it today. So next time I can predict whether or not it'll actually appear. And I think sometimes people go in there and they're like, well, they didn't predict my test. I'm like, no, your test just didn't have anything that covered what we were trying to predict. When it turned out that content was used on this exam, it was exactly what we predicted. But for some people, they'll be like, I didn't get any of that. I'm like, right, I can't control that. We cannot predict every single test out there. They have too many tools at their disposal. What we're trying to predict is things that we think are going to come up. And it's been happening for a while now that what we think is going to come up is. And yes, that gives you some advantages in RC in terms of like, hey, you could study a little bit about cryptomnesia and understand what it is. And that I think is helpful personally. But you'd also know when you saw that passage, this is a real section, among other things.
I'll make a third point to that, which is something that we typically haven't emphasized here previously, but I think it's worthwhile. A large part because I saw what you did on Reddit, which was a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding, and frankly, some misrepresentation. And it didn't bother me so much as I was just like, man, I don't think people realize the value of this resource, either to its full extent or in the way that we're trying to actually convey the value itself. So that's what got me. I started to write it as like a Reddit post. And I was like, this would be better as a podcast because we can really flesh it out and talk through it. So I held off on posting, although I did make some comments. And that third and final piece to this is that when we have specific things that we expect are going to appear, Vermeer is a good example, or cryptomnesia and plagiarism, as you mentioned. Back in August, you and I both specifically said, go read about this Cascadia earthquake in 1700 and the tsunamis and the Japanese ghost forest. If you see it, it's real. Read about it, it's likely to appear. And sure enough, it was in the most tested reading comprehension section of the entire week for August. So over and over, we use these things to inform what we tell people to study, both topically and in terms of actual LSAT content. When we build the problem sets, the recommended problem sets in the crystal balls and mini balls, they are dedicated specifically to be relevant to these topics, to these ideas. And I'm going to actually emphasize as I go through the reading comp from this week, which of the recommended passages are hits and matches to the topics that just appeared. Something we haven't done before, but I really want to try to drive this point home because I continually see it being missed.
Yeah, you and I talked a little bit about it. I think it was Friday night that we were kind of going through that. And I think we'll do the podcast because when I was looking at some of those posts, I was like, it's still not clear to people how to use this or really what it is. And I guess the best way I can describe it is it's a much more sophisticated instrument than it appears to be. It is not a blunt instrument. You can't just say predicts it all. You know, sometimes I think about things that are really strong and powerful, like identify the conclusion, but it's also a blunt force thing. You're trying to figure out something that is in many cases fairly straightforward or obvious, or they're clear tells. This has a greater degree of refinement and sophistication to it in terms of what we're doing. I think maybe we need to explain ourselves a little bit more broadly because I see a lot of people, especially other tutors and representatives from certain companies who clearly don't understand it and I don't think they can comprehend that it's possible. I mean, honestly, if I was in their shoes, I would have the exact same response of like, there's no way they can do this. It's got to be something that's just a trick or it's really broad and it won't help. I'm like, no. It's actually something far different. It won't hit for everybody. We know that. We make that clear up front. It's why it's called a crystal ball, not a future reality. But for the people that it does hit, as you and I see repeatedly in our messages afterwards, it's like, I knew immediately that the first section of RC was real. And when I hit the second one, which was harder, I knew it wasn't scored and I was able to relax. That kind of stuff is tremendously helpful to the people who understand how to use this properly. So John, I blame us. We need to actually make it clearer to everybody how it's supposed to be used and the kind of tool that it actually is, because I'm telling you, I've been doing the LSAT for a long time. And I consider this to be like one of the pinnacle achievements. It amazes me every single time we get it right. I know that most people don't really understand that because it seems like it just happens every time. I'm like, for 50 years, people couldn't do this. Now, all of a sudden, we're in a period where for like 4 or 5 years, we're going to be able to do it. And I think it's going to stop at some point. But right now, the train keeps it rolling. So
yeah, you've been doing this well since what, like the 1900s?
Yeah, that's hilarious.
No, thanks.
Certainly you have since the 1840s with your hot toddy, so I don't want to hear about it.
Bringing it back. You mentioned some other tutors and some disparagement. Let's name names. You ready?
I would never do that. I love my fellow tutors out there who, help people with the LSAT, because I think the vast majority of them really mean well. And of course, if I was in their shoes and I heard of something about this, I'd be like, it's ridiculous. Nobody can predict this test, because nobody could for years. We are in a very specific, special set of circumstances that is allowing this to happen. And I've said that repeatedly now. I'm like, I don't expect it's going to last forever. It's a golden age. But to me, every single time we do this, it's like climbing Everest every single day for a week. It's typically not possible and insane to even try, but it is happening. On that note, John, let's get into the real content with RC.
All right, perfect. So here's what we saw just as an overview of the reading comp. There was a whole lot of it swirling around. 3 scored sections from what we could tell, and then 2 experimental sections, one used experimentally much more often than the other. Let me run through the real sections first, as we tend to do, and then we'll pause there and see who wants to do the experimental stuff. So the first real reading comprehension section, we saw this straight out of the gate Wednesday morning. Happily, it was a gratifying start to the week, because this is the November 2022 section that we predicted, topic by topic. Here were the 4 passages, 27 questions. If these ring a bell, it was real. So there was a passage on Vermeer and his daughter Maria. It was specific to the painting Girl with a Pearl Earring and had to do with some degree of maybe debate or confusion as to who painted it. Authorship in paintmanship. What would you call authorship of a painting? Authorship?
Painted
by either Vermeer or Maria. Surely there's a fancier word. Surely I should know it. But here's the cool thing about this. Not only did we talk about Vermeer and his daughter Maria in this painting in the crystal ball and the mini ball, it was there in both. I put a passage into the recommended problem set about Vermeer. Art forgeries from PT 145. It was the experimental October 10 passage number 2. There you go. I told you to go read a passage about this exact thing, and it came. It showed up. There was another passage in that section about accidental subconscious plagiarism, something called cryptomnesia, which Dave has referenced. And it had to do with, I think, Canadian plagiarism rights and copyrights. There were 2 passages in the problem set that I put in there specifically in case this came up. The third passage was about corporate executive morality. It was a comparative. There was a passage in the problem set about this as well, corporate criminal liability, specifically from PT 158. We saw these coming. We gave you analogs to them in the problem sets, and we gave you these topics very specifically to research. And then finally, maybe the most interesting to me, certainly the hardest for most people, was a Hindu astronomy passage. It was about a book of Hindu astronomy predictions, and the question was whether they came up with this independently or used past Greek predictions in astronomy things for aid. Dave has referenced this as well, that there were a couple of astronomy passages. This was one, and it led to some confusion because, as we'll see in a second, there was an astronomy passage in another real section as well. But that was the main section of reading comp that we saw throughout the week, and the one that we predicted most closely.
Yeah, I think the Canadian copyright one, the cryptomnesia, was the one that kind of triggered me starting to think about, we need to explain this better. Because somebody was like, oh, they said there would be something about Canadian copyrights, and the comment, and I think it's a reasonable comment, was that's such a broad field that you can't learn anything about it that's going to be specifically helpful. I actually agree with that. So I'm not disagreeing with that, but we didn't stop by just saying Canadian copyrights. We said cryptomnesia, which I'm going to wager that very few of the people who took the LSAT knew about that word or what it was, unless they'd been in that kind of like a psychology major in college. You just wouldn't have encountered it. Yeah, Canadian copyrights by itself isn't going to be super helpful, but connecting it to this plagiarism cryptomnesia idea is going to be helpful, and that's the difference. If it was just broad, like, John, I think there's going to be a passage about an author, and there's going to be another one about history, and then there's going to be another one about, science. Who cares? That'd be useless, and I would be critical of somebody claiming that was anything special. That's not what we are doing.
No. Although you referenced that passage again, so I'll just drive the point home. I said there were two problem set matches for this idea. One was literally specifically about Canadian copyrights from PT 115, passage 4. Another was about specifically plagiarism. It's a tricky comparative passage from PT 158, it's passage 3. So again, we gave everyone the tools, not just for the topic, but to practice those topics kind of in an LSAT sense as well.
From release sections.
From release things that you could go actually do. Yeah. So
it's not perfect, but it helps.
We did this in August when I gave people a passage about the Big Bang, and then sure enough, one appeared. So this is really what we're trying to get to. It's expectation, it's passage topic, it's passage representativeness and relevance. All of these together kind of form the nucleus of what these crystal ball sessions are meant to be.
All right, let's go to the next section that was real.
Another real section, also sourced from November 22, but this was the third usage of it. So one that we weren't trying to predict quite as closely topically, but one where we did at least get the source test right. The original version of this came from February 2021. 27 questions. Here were the 4 topics. One was about Frances Harper and women's suffrage. It was a passage, here's the other astronomy passage, ancient astronomy, but in this case, it was about them not using sophisticated or sometimes any instruments, and it forming the basis for astrology, interestingly enough. The comparative passage in that set was about aesthetic knowledge and judgments and testimony. It used the example of movie critics. And then finally, a passage in there about copyrights and whether they last too long, differentiation between the types of copyrights, books, movies, and I believe music. But again, there was another passage on copyrights elsewhere. So you're starting to see right away 2 astronomy passages, a couple on copyrights and plagiarism and things. They love to have these overlaps. And this is why you have to be so specific when you recall or recount what it was that you saw. Otherwise, the confusion just builds and builds.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine someone's like, well, I had astronomy and copyrights, and someone else would think, I had that too.
I had that too. One of you had Vermeer and one of you had Frances Harper. Those are 2 different sections.
Yeah, and you wouldn't know because the specifics are different unless you actually kind of delved further into it. So, I mean, we understand the challenge. Consider this good test making. You know, my hat's off to LSAC on this. They would say, we don't do that on purpose. And then if we could see them, they'd smile a little, maybe smirk. Because I'm like, well, you do this so often that I'm starting to think that it's intentional. And now I'm fully of the belief it is. And quite honestly, John, if you and I were making this test, we would do this too, because this would stop people from figuring things out as easily. And that would be our goal as well. So I'm not complaining about it at all. I'm just saying if this is the mountain you're going to climb taking the LSAT, understand what the test makers are doing. This is part of the process. The more you know, the more powerful and comfortable you become as a test taker. Our goal in this podcast and in all the courses and books that we write and put out there is to make people more comfortable with the test taking experience. So suck up the information, understand your enemy, and you become more powerful.
Yeah. Truth is, if you and I were making this test, we would have shut down what you and I are doing about this test a long time ago.
I wouldn't allow it?
Nope.
But of course, you and I have talked about the fact that it's really, you can't shut it down entirely.
It's public information and speculation. Those are fair game.
Yeah. If we've tracked it for this long and no one else has, that's our information, but it was public information. And so we have that advantage. But again, we also play by a certain set of rules, which is we don't do this during the test. We do this after the test. We have this conversation where we recap this. And I think that's a really important thing because we're not trying to give somebody an advantage on day 1 of the test versus day 2 or day 3. Once the test starts, to me, it's like, I'm not going to talk publicly about the exam other than, hey, this is how the test is going. This is how many people have taken it. Anybody who follows me on Twitter knows that I'll kind of like give updates if there's problems and so forth like that. But it's not test specific. It's very general in terms of numbers and test takers and so forth.
Perfect. One more set of real reading comprehension that we saw floating around. And as always, there is new content. This was all, as far as we can tell, new, which means we've never seen it tested previously in the past as a scored section. It was a passage that some people found difficult. It was about techniques as a jazz pianist, specifically about Thelonious Monk. And it was kind of critical of his technique. There was a passage I'd love to read about panspermia, which is the notion that life on Earth may have originated outside of Earth. In this case, possibly on Mars. And due to ejected rocks from Mars, they could have come to Earth with some basic building blocks of life, like amino acids or proteins. There was a tricky, maybe the trickiest passage from a lot of people's standpoint in this section about mini kitchen remodeling post-World War II, so in the 1950s. And it was pretty critical, I think, of some of the advertisements built around this idea of, renovating houses and the costs that were involved. And then the comparative passage, which I think was last, don't quote me on that, but it was about the effectiveness of precautionary principles and regulations. So a pretty generic one there. But that was 4 passages, all real, but stuff, like we say, that we're not trying to predict those. We couldn't. It was brand new. Nobody saw Monk coming.
I heard more than a few people say that mini kitchen one was actually kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I heard a few complaints about the precautionary principles and the PP passage, that kind of thing. And there's basic rules about that. That's the kind of thing that if you hadn't encountered it before, and maybe in the future when we predict that they're going to reuse this section, we'll talk about precautionary principles, because you can go read about it and be like, oh, okay, that's the kind of information where it's specific enough you could get something out of it. But
if we're still doing this in 2026, when that's likely to come up again,
we'll see.
I don't know. We'll see.
We'll figure that out when we get to it. I got to get to 2025 first, man. 2024 is not even over.
I was going to request you push me off of a high place.
I'll be happy to do that.
I thought you might.
The higher, the better.
Well, on that generous note, while you're feeling generous, Dave, why don't you take the 2 experimental sections?
Only 2 experimental RCs that we saw. And the first one came up a lot with the passage that we just talked about, the mini kitchen set. This one had 27 questions, and the passages covered things like decolonizing African history and the Nigerian artist, I think it was Jimmy Salanka, that was out there, who just died earlier this year in February. Then, interestingly, John, I know this annoyed you, there was a passage about the Big Bang and neutrino particles, N particles, and matter versus antimatter. There's one about police department reimbursing a plaintiff for vehicle impound fee that occurred during an investigation, which, obviously is in that kind of legal vein of who owes what and so forth. And then the top-down effects of perception. And I think that involved an experiment with ball and paddles. I certainly went out and looked at that a little more closely, and that's something that they actually have used to try to figure out the effects of perception and so forth. This set did not count. Doesn't matter whether it was first, second, third, or fourth. It didn't count. The one about the top-down effects of perception or on perception was the comparative passage. But if you had Salanka or Big Bang or the impound fee, that was a section that was experimental. It will appear in the future, I'm sure, but it was not scored for your purposes. The other experimental section was also 27 questions, and I'll just cover a couple of the passages there. Turing test and AI. So Alan Turing, obviously hugely important to kind of like computers and so forth. They were talking about that. That was the comparative passage. Another legal-based passage on bad Samaritan laws and the legality of that. If you don't help someone else out, you're not a good Samaritan, but you're a bad one. And then one, John, that I think that probably both you and I would be interested in. It's about one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, and that would be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the high terraces within those gardens. Lost to history now, but I love that kind of ancient stuff, so I would totally be down for checking this out, like the Colossus at Rhodes, the mausoleum at like Alexandria, and all that kind of cool stuff. But this was about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and that also, so you had Turing, the Bad Samaritan, the Hanging Gardens, that was also an experimental section. Automatically, even if you can't remember your other section from what we've talked about, the other section was real. So by negation, so to speak.
There you go. And that covers the reading comp. So hopefully that's good news. If anybody struggled with those experimentals and it's been keeping you up nights, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. And if you're feeling good about the real ones that we just described, that's great news too.
All right, let's move to logical reasoning then. And whereas there were 3 scored sections of reading comprehension, there were actually 4 scored sections of logical reasoning. So earlier you heard John and I talk about the fact that there were really 18 possible combinations of kind of like the main usage sections on this test. Well, 2 of the 4 sections were scored for everybody. So when you have 4 sections like this, if you ignore order, you really have 6 combinations, and then you can pair it with any one of the 3 RC. 3 times 6, that's your 18 right there. So out of these 4 sections, everyone should have 2 of them as kind of something that they saw. Now, the reason we don't think that there were 18 combinations and all in kind of like the maximize is that a lot of times they put these in pairs and so forth. So I think, John, we'll split this in half. I'll do the first two, which are really the sections that originally were used back in November of 2022.
Yeah, these were the two that we predicted.
Yeah. So this was something that we kind of felt like was going to come up, and I will try to separate these out by section and make them as clear as possible. And John, I'm sure that you're going to have some comments about some of this stuff too, so feel free to chime in. The first section here was 25 questions and was, again, from November of 2022. Here's some of the questions that you had, like sour milk and the formation of cheese and the use of enzymes, male blue songbirds and their nesting habits, cave art and paintings and whether people were religious, the pre-modern humans using bones as tools and that happening earlier than expected, chimps and baboons in an alliance and socializing between the groups, the kind of like arboreal primates, youth becoming more libertarian. That's an interesting one. And so I think, that set of questions right there probably should be enough for anyone. That's like, 20% of the questions that were in that section, at least you should be able to say, all right, I know where that was. If you're like, I can't remember that was section or 1 or 3, I will repeat a piece of advice that we always give people. When you take a practice test, after you finish each section, jot down a few of the questions so that you can remember it later. When you finish an actual LSAT, jot down a few of the questions from each section so you can place it later. This will help you on a day like today when you're trying to figure out what was experimental and what was real. So often people don't do that, and they're like, they think they're going to remember because, it's just an intense experience. They just went through it. They can remember everything crystal clear. 3 hours later, they're like, I don't know if that question about the chimps and baboons was section 1 or section 3. And then sometimes there's other sections that have the same topics in them, as we'll see in the next section here. And then you're like, wait a second, which question was it? And it becomes even harder. So do yourself a favor as a test taker. If you're coming up in October or November or a later exam, make notes as a habit on every practice test, every real test. That'll help you figure out afterwards what was real and what was experimental.
2 quick comments before you move on. First, when you mentioned section 1 or section 3, you gave a good piece of advice, but it was different than I anticipated. I thought you were going to say, if you ask us, was that my first or my third LR, you are asking a nonsense question. Section orders vary by person. This could have appeared in anyone's 4 sections, anywhere.
Yeah.
It would have always been scored no matter where it was, but there's no relevance to this, a reference point for this to a section specific. So ignore section order forever, please and thank you. And second, I was thinking about this morning because I got so many people who are like, I can't remember anything, or these things just don't stick with me. And it occurred to me that one of the best ways to help to remember, at least like talking points or small topics like this, is to write it down in the moment. You have scratch paper. And I'm not encouraging you to take notes so that you can refer to them after the test. I'm saying the physical act of writing these things down while you test will help to firm them up and ingrain them basically in your mind. They will stick with you longer if you've done the physical notation of them. First question's about sour milk and formation of cheese. I'm not saying it was question 1. I'm just saying if it was. Just cordon off your scratch paper into sections. Number 1, sour milk, cheese. Do that a few times through a section, and that will ingrain itself in your mind. You will remember it so much more clearly after the fact. Tear up your scratch paper. Don't look at it. It will help you remember, though. So again, take the 4 or 5 seconds that requires through a section to really make sure these things stick. That's one good way to do it.
Yeah, the act of writing and places it in your memory.
Yep.
And you were trying to rely on your memory afterwards to be able to say, this is where I had this, because especially with 3LR people, it's a disaster. It's so difficult. I'm not envious of anyone with 3LR trying to figure out what's going on. 2RC is so much easier to figure out the experimental. The 3LR people are like, it's just messy. So my sympathies if you had the 3LR and you're trying to figure it out, but also do the things, create the habits that help you help yourself. You're not completely off the hook here if you didn't take notes or if you didn't really try to remember this, because we've been telling you that is something you should be doing for quite a while now, over a year at this point. All right, all that conversation aside, that was just one section. All right, so if you had male blue songbirds, wherever it was, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you had sour milk and cheese and humans using bones as tools earlier than expected, that was a real section no matter where you saw it. Here's another real section, also from November of 2022. A question about shopping centers, really malls, and parking garages in the town of Elk Grove. I don't think that was Elk Grove, Illinois. I don't think they specified it, but I always think of Elk Grove as being Illinois. Notice there's another parking garage question in a different section. So don't think parking garage, I got this. It has to be specific to Elk Grove and, shopping centers.
Quick note. The other one was an experimental section on a parking garage or parking lot in Springville. So if you had 2 on parking garages, Elk Grove counted. Springville did not. We're not going to spend any time really exploring experimentals, but that to me is a good illustration of why detail is important here.
Yeah, and it's a classic example of, we've said before, we're not going to cover experimentals because as soon as we do, it gets even more confusing for people. We keep all that information, so in the future, we know what the usages are. That goes into our database. But we found that when we talked about it on the podcast in the past, it actually created many more questions. And once we eliminated and said, this is what we know is real, and this appears to be all the real LR, it made it way easier for people.
I was planning to mention that, but I'm glad you hit it here.
Yeah, covered it. All right, so shopping centers in Elk Grove. All right, next question, tenants, kind of like upper and lower, who pay for utilities for common area use. I hate common area fees. Beta carotene and your health as it relates to cancer. Animals living in unpopulated areas despite toxic or polluted soil in that particular area. A new freeway being built to reduce traffic, but instead what it does is it increases it. Bike in a TV box reduced the shipping damage that the bike actually incurred. And that, I think, again, gives us 5 or 6 questions that is a pretty good look at what we're looking at.
I love that bike in a TV box. Just the principle that they were shipping bikes that were getting all busted up, but as soon as they put them in something that basically said fragile on the outside, the shippers in transit took better care of the contents. It was the same
bike. I thought it was a TV and it was going to get punched through.
Yeah.
I think there's another bike question in there about rain during a bicycle race, but I don't have the notes in front of me as well. But John, there's a really interesting note about that one about the freeway being built to reduce traffic, but it increases. You want to address that?
This is another one of those November 2022 LR sections. The first one that Dave went through was as well.
Yeah.
So these first 2 both come from that source test. So we actually had some good information on these from the first time they appeared a couple years back. And what was interesting about this is we heard over and over from people, they're like, I recognize this freeway question, a freeway being built to reduce traffic to a suburb. They're like, we've seen this before. And so naturally, you and I, given the resources that we have, went and we tracked down what it was we figured they were referring to. And lo and behold, this is a stimulus, at least, that is available. This is from an actual disclosed question. It's not the same question, but it is the same argument. It's the same scenario in the stimulus about this freeway to a suburb. Specifically, if you want to go try to look this up for yourself, this comes from the first logical reasoning section. I've only got the old PT number, unfortunately, PT 78, question number 17. We've confirmed this with multiple people back 2022. We did it this week with people as well. Like, is this the one you're talking about? I'm like, yes. I'm not going crazy. I have seen this before. What LSAC has done here is they've used a stimulus again, a disclosed stimulus again, but attached a new question and different answer choices to it.
Very rare.
Yeah, very rare.
Also, this isn't, if somebody's like, oh man, people in kind of like October and November are going to get huge advantage. This isn't going to be used in October and November. This won't be used again for a while. So this is the kind of thing where there's just literally no impact whatsoever. But I know some people thought that they were like losing their minds. They're like, I've seen this. This is weird, and they're questioning themselves. I'm like, no. Your judgment is actually solid. This is just a very unusual scenario. I've seen it happen a couple of times before in the past. This is a new instance of it. So
what's funny is 99 times out of 100 when we hear those reports from people, it's like, a similar topic. I've read this passage before. No, you have not.
No, you haven't.
But in John, this particular case, yeah, there you go.
I'll let you hit the remaining 2 sections that are real here that weren't from November 2022.
Perfect. Yeah. So there's 2 additional sets. And let me put it this way. There are at least 2 additional sets of real logical reasoning. It is entirely possible, as Dave has already mentioned, that there's another real section floating around out there. It might have been given sporadically or more rarely. We just didn't hear about it. So this is, as far as we know, the other two real ones. If there's an additional reel somewhere, it's never too late to let us know. It's just too late for us to cover it. So here's one reel section that we know, and this is all new content. We have not seen this tested previously before as scored. The hardest question, I think, in this set, and maybe the most distinctive, people will recognize this right away, was about security clearance. 3 people at a company, 1 has security clearance, 2 don't, and it's trying to figure out how it is that they can essentially pass back and forth some sort of classified document or something. And the reason this was so distinctive is this had that logic game, mini logic game type of feel to it, highly conditional, almost a formal logic, connectivity between the variables and the nature of the answer choices. This is exactly the sort of thing that Dave and I have been harping on through the crystal balls really all year. We're telling you, we've told you repeatedly this is coming. This is the type of question that we showed as a real version in the crystal ball before August, and in the mini ball, obviously, for this test too. So the reason we had to make it private is we showed a question just like this, deliberately, knowing this is coming.
Yeah, they've been testing it.
Exactly. They've been testing it experimentally. We've been saying this is going to be real soon, and these new sections are now starting to include it. Here you go.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is this, is in hindsight, I probably would have gone back and I would have said, don't expect this to show up in August. They're not going to do it on the first one because they don't want to make it look like there's anything new or they're adding anything. Have questions like this appeared before? Absolutely. All right. So the claim that this is new to the LSAT, that's not the case. We're not making that claim. Our theory is that having watched experimental sections now for several years, especially in the last year, since the announcement that Logic Games was going away, we just noticed more experimentals with kind of like a heavier numbers and percentage focus, more formal logic. These things had all appeared before, but we started to see them more frequently and more notably, and in some cases in a more complicated form on these experimentals. I should have thought they're not going to do anything unusual in August. It's going to be the most kind of like milquetoast bland thing in the world. Should have thought about that beforehand. But to see it here in September didn't surprise me at all. And I think we'll continue to see these and then maybe some increasing numbers. Is it going to be 10 out of the 25 questions that somebody might see? No, it's not going to take over like that. But even having, say, 2 or 3 of these, whereas you only had 0 before, is a big difference because for a lot of people, they take a lot of time. So just, kind of like when we make predictions and we think about it, this is the nuance that we're talking about in terms of what we're talking in frequency terms.
Yeah, and notice where they're appearing. They're, up until really about this point, primarily experimental. Certainly they're not appearing in the reuse stuff. The ones that Dave went through from November 22, they wouldn't be there because they weren't doing it back then. They're starting to appear in the new content, which means this is becoming the new normal. So that is a real question in a real section. If you saw it, hopefully you're okay. Again, we've been predicting and telling people to study this. We've shown examples. Hopefully you're all right, but it did count. I know that's probably not great news for everybody.
I'm sorry to actually tell people that it counted because these last sections, I think, were a little more challenging maybe than the earlier ones, as we'll get to. But keep this in mind. The people who make this test, they aren't completely consistent. Every LSAT doesn't have just 1 of these, 2 of these, 3 of these. Things come and go. There's an ebb and flow to the way they present ideas. Back when we had Logic Games, it was really easy to show how the ebb and flow of concepts was something that was these large cycles, 5 to 10 years at a time. Same thing here. I can go back and show you a ton of formal logic questions that are much older. And then there's a long period where there's not many of them at all. So to have them brought back, the people who make this test would say, this isn't a new concept, the LSAT logical reasoning, and they are right. All right. I'm not denying what they're saying at all. They just haven't been testing it as much. And new doesn't mean that it's the same as the prior testing rate. They can start testing it more, claim it's not new, but it can still have an effect on your test taking. Anyway, that's just one question in this section, so I'll let you finish.
Yeah, we won't deep dive every single question example that I'm about to get to here. But that one was special, so that's why I started with it. I'm glad we dove deep. Let me touch on a couple more of these. There was a question in this section about the benefits, particularly of vigorous exercise for pregnant women. There was one about kind of arguing against some people that oil resource conservation is in fact urgent, that we don't maybe have the supply to meet the demand going forward. A question a lot of people were talking about safe drivers and vehicle maintenance. It might have been they performed their own vehicle maintenance, but either way it was routine or regular, and it helped them to be better drivers and avoid obstacles. There was a question here about computers being intelligent because they could perform complex functions. I think the example it gave was beating experts at chess. Reminds me a little bit of the Turing test from that experimental reading comp passage. Obviously, the Turing test is more conversational, but same vein. Question that really struck home for me, which is liver damage and drinking coffee and certain enzymes. If coffee gives you liver damage too, Dave, I don't have a prayer.
I don't drink it, so I'd be fine.
Well, Snake DNA was here, Youth Hostels was here, and then one more question I want to conclude this on, because this got people confused as well. It was about infectious diseases in developed countries, is how a lot of people described it, but then a lot of other people described the same question somewhat differently. They talked about children's exposure to germs at an early age and the autoimmune response that came about. That was the same question, but notice again how detail matters. If you focused on infectious diseases versus an autoimmune response to germs, it might not be clear that you're talking about the same thing, but in fact, that was the same question.
Yep.
So there you go. That was a real section, all new, and then a final real section that'll wrap it up, and then we'll get into the scoring predictions themselves. The other new, back to you. The other new section of logical reasoning that we saw, there was a question about a toy manufacturing company having declining sales due, it presumed at least, to using celebrities in their advertisements. It was one about companies relying on customer satisfaction surveys and the effects that had on company growth. National park tourism in the 80s and 90s. There was one, this is probably the biggest, trickiest question from this. It was about heritable disease. Notice again, disease question topic coming up again. This specifically, though, nobody seemed to know the name of the disease, and I've been too lazy to try to look it up. But it was Howe something or Hendrickson's disease, and then TLA2 or TLR6 genes. That was a real question in a real section. There were questions in here too about a decline in the population of large fish, oceanic fish due to commercial fishing, overfishing, mice in the cold in the Arctic, and then rules conditional question. I feel like this one had a little bit of gamesishness to it about conditional rules for how taxis versus limos are allowed to charge riders for rides. Those were all real, should have been in the same section, but if you recognize even a couple of them, that section was scored.
I have that H to Z somewhere written down.
Oh, thank God you finished that sentence.
I have.
I was like, oh no, it's the worst possible outlet to announce that.
Yeah, I wouldn't really be talking about something like that. I have the notes that confirm whatever it is elsewhere, and I probably haven't added them entirely to the database at this point, but I do have that information.
I swear I literally did a double take when you said it. I was like, buddy, you're on mic.
Sorry. I wasn't trying to make some kind of surprise disclosure here. All right. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the real coverage. And it's so weird these days because we don't do logic games. So I think our conversation, John, was actually pretty lengthy about what was real RC and what was real LR, because we had a number of sidebars that I think were actually worthwhile to the conversation, especially as it relates to future test takers. But one of the things that a lot of people are really most interested in is what's going to happen with the scaling on this and what kind of prediction that we have. I do think we're going to get some real tests released later this year. That won't help people who took August or September to know what their scales were, but it may confirm some scale predictions that we made perhaps last year. We'll see. It's been, is it 30, 40 years where they've released at least one LSAT each year, and we have an unbroken streak. So I think we're going to get an LSAT sometime in the next 2 months or so. That is wholly unofficial. That is not coming from LSAC at all. It's just a suspicion based upon their prior patterns. So right now, the best that we can do is make our, true and honest estimations of what we see in the scale. So let's talk about how we do this. Difficulty is easiest to see at the highest level. We can really see that coming out of it much more easily than we can the mid-level difficulty. It's hard for us to see the mid-level difficulty unless we actually read the problems ourselves. We may know quite a bit about the section, but we don't know every single word. We don't know every single answer. And so the higher level difficulty is what sticks out to us, which means that we start to look at these tests as an overall baseline difficulty at the 170 level. We're trying to predict how many questions you can miss to get a 170. And as we've talked about in prior really crystal balls, as well as I think in the podcast, even though the new test format has more questions, the scales aren't hugely different than they were before. So the number of questions isn't causing a big difference in most instances. When we did this prior to the removal of logic games, what we did was we said we're going to start at a baseline and you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. And then we would take a look at each section. We thought we might change that when we got to the August LSAT. We might have to move it to 8. But when we looked at the scales that LSAC had released, we noticed that they were actually remarkably consistent, and the majority of these scales were really around like 8 or so. And so we continue to start off the process of this discussion at -7. And what we're going to do is we're first going to go through each of the scored RC. And so everybody's at -7 right now. And as you listen to this, depending upon which section you had, your scale will either kind of stay at 7 or it'll move to 8 questions that you could miss. So when you see people saying you can miss 7, 8, 9, it means how many you can miss to get that 170. The thing I'll note, as I always do, is when we're on the line, when we're not really certain, what we'll do is we'll use that kind of like half-point increment. And a lot of times I've seen people afterwards like, what the hell does that mean? That's a legitimate question. So I'm not dismissing it at all. And what I would say is the half point means this: we don't think it moves the scale at 170, but it will move the scale as you go lower, say 165, 160. So you wouldn't add a point if you were a 170 score, but if you were a 160 score and you're trying to figure out how many questions you could miss, you'd think, all right, that would add a question for me that I normally wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So this was our way where the binary 0, 1 didn't really work. We're like, it's kind of in the middle. It's not hard enough to change the toughest or the best test takers' experience, but it is going to change it for other test takers. So everybody starts at -7. Let's start off with that Vermeer, cryptomnesia, plagiarism, the executive morality, and the Hindu astronomy section. This was probably the hardest of the week of tests. This is going to move your score, if you had it, your scoring scale from 7 questions you could have missed to 8 questions you could have missed. And I think for a lot of people, that's a relief. Just so you know, this is what we had it previously when we predicted this. So this is not a change from that.
Can I add a quick point? I hate to...
You go right ahead.
Imagine, just to cycle back to the crystal ball and these, to me, ludicrous debates of value. Imagine that you had known those topics, you had researched it a little bit. You go into this, you know that section's real, and it turns out you had not only the hardest section of the week, you're going to get a point benefit for it, and you could have seen all 4 passage topics coming and studied them to some degree. You combine all of those factors for this particular section, and then try to debate me as to whether or not knowing these topics or having some sort of insight in advance is worth it. Clearly it is. The hardest section here is the one we most accurately predicted down to the 4 topics themselves.
No, I saw you went on Reddit and actually was like, I'm going to throw my 2 cents in on this. It was bothering you. And then you wanted to make another post, and I think that's the post where we're going to turn it into a podcast.
That's post-turn podcast. That's exactly right.
Anyway, we all started at -7. If you had Vermeer and cryptomnesia, you've moved to 8. Let's say you had the other section that had appeared from that test, which was kind of like the suffrage, the ancient astronomy, not the Hindu astronomy, but the ancient astronomy, the aesthetic, non-aesthetic knowledge, and copyright lengths and so forth. Also tough. We think this moves the scale as well. So you as well would go from 7 to 8. And then the last one is that kind of newer one, the Thelonious Monk, the panspermia with the kind of stuff coming from Mars and the biological transfer, the mini kitchens and the precautionary principles. I think John and I have debated this, and I'm not sure we're on entirely the same page. I might be of the mindset that it actually moves it more. But when we have this kind of argument, what we've done is we've made it 0.5, which means for a 170, it's not going to move you. You'd be still at 7. If you're down south of 170, you would find a benefit because we think there's some really tough stuff in there. So this is... I don't think our view of this is as rock solid as maybe the first 2, which we feel much more comfortable with, which is also seen multiple times before. So we've had that confirmed for us.
Yeah, a broader audience, multiple testings, that does help. This is new, so it's our first ever experience with it. I like that you made me the villain in that.
Yes, you're a villain.
Keep going.
Yes. So everybody's either -8 or they're what we'd call 7.5, meaning if you're -7.5, you have to ask yourself, where am I scoring? If you're scoring at the 170 level, you're -7. If you are scoring at 160, now you're thinking, all right, I do get the extra question from that. There's enough difficulty in there that it's going to help me out. All right, so you take those numbers, and now we go into the LR, and we'll go through each of the 4 LR and either move it or not move it, depending upon the section. We'll start with the November 22, the Sour Milk, the Blue Songbirds, the Religious Cave Art, the Libertarian Youths. As before, we had predicted this doesn't move the scale at all. We do not think it moves the scale at all. This is also going to be the case for the other November 22 section, which was the tenants' common area utility payments, the beta carotene, the bike and a TV box that John likes so much. Previously, we predicted that didn't move the scale. We thought that was a very reasonable section, and we're going to continue to hold to that. So if you were, say, a person who had Vermeer and then those 2 sections, what we're saying is you can miss 8 questions and get a 170. That would be you in its entirety right there. All right, let's go to the new sections that we talked about, both of which we think has more of an effect than just 0. The first one is that kind of like harder level security clearance question. There's a group scholarships, the pregnant women doing exercise, and snake DNA, which sounds fun to me. We're going to call this a 0.5 as well. I think we felt pretty comfortable with that, meaning that if you had this and you're a 170 score, it doesn't change anything. But if you're a 160 score and so on, it does give you a benefit. That's the meaning of the 0.5. If you had, say, the Thelonious Monk RC, and then you get this LR, those 2.5s would add up to probably move it 1 at your level. So this is why you have to track your individual sections. And then the last one, which is the LR that had toy manufacturing, the 80s park tourism, the heritable disease that I don't think that I have, but I scared John into thinking that I have, and then mice in the Arctic. We thought this was probably the toughest of the week, and that this, in fact, would move the section by 1. I don't think our prediction on that is hurt by the fact that I think this section had 26 questions, if I'm recalling off the top of my head. So you've got to start at 7, and then you got to find your RC, and then you got to find your 2 LR, and then add all that up and figure it out. You've got a bunch of 8s, 8.5s, that kind of thing. If you were like a 9.5 person, that means at 170, you're still 9.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of LSATs out there on the new scalings that go from 7 to 10, so 9 is not at all unusual in the way things work out, but you're going to have to pick it out because there's a lot of actual outcomes here. We can't go through every single one of the 18 permutations, but that's your job to listen and make sure that you have that. Regardless, we will all find out how it turned out on Wednesday, September 25th at 9 a.m. Eastern when scores are released.
And there we go.
That's it.
Yeah, nice work. That's a lot to get through. But I am glad. I mean, we took a lot of sidebars on this one. We dove a little deeper into some instances, individual questions. Certainly, we circled back to the crystal ball because that's a bit of a thorn in my paw at the moment. I'm clearly over it, Dave.
Yeah, you're clearly not. The funny thing is, I think especially, we want to help people who just took the LSAT as much as possible. We always want to prepare people for the next LSAT because there's always a group of people who are like listening out of a point of interest. And some of the people who took this test are likely to take the next LSAT or the November LSAT. So I think sometimes people skip to this part and they're like, okay, I just want to see what they say about the scaling prediction. I'd go back and listen to this one because I think that the sidebars were actually at times fascinating in a relative sense. All right, we're talking about the LSAT. You and I would rather talk about music and find that fascinating. But honestly, from the standpoint of, living in the LSAT world, I think we were able to get into some things that are a little bit more nuanced and interesting, and also to kind of like give some advice that's like make people better test takers going forward, because you can always get better for next time. And if you're retaking the LSAT, or if it's just your first time in the future, you want to do as well as you possibly can. And the more you know, the more powerful you will be in those circumstances.
I've got nothing to add to that. Well done.
Thank you very much. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions about this test, about sections that we talked about the scales, if you want to say, hey, I think I might have had a section you didn't talk about, please send all that information and any questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope the test went incredibly well for you. We hope that the score release that's coming up on September 25th is going to be fantastic. In the meantime, stay calm, have fun, and be safe out there. Thanks.